issues, so everything is okay now. So thank you very much for having me as a presenter in this webinar. And first of all, let me congratulate ICMPD for this very, very timely, informative, and innovative study. Really, really helpful. I would like just to underline two aspects, but we will have an opportunity to talk more extensively about this during the webinar. Two methodological approaches that are give added value to this study. One is the fact that not only identified victims have been taken into consideration in the study, but also what we can call presumed or potential victims, persons that have been considered by trained staff from NGOs, for example, as showing indications of trafficking, but not identified as such. And this gives a very different landscape and shows how much trafficking is linked with migration flows and vulnerabilities that are connected with the situation of migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees. The second aspect is the fact that not only vulnerability has been underlined as a component of this very complex landscape, but also resilience. And we know very well that contrary to the stereotype of the trafficking victim, among the population that is potentially targeted by traffickers, there are people that show the capacity of resilience, and there is so much strength in this, potentially vulnerable population that has to be taken into consideration also by the authorities. The authorities think that if a person is not the perfect victim, with no agency, with no possibility to resist to anything, she is not a real victim, or he is not a real victim. This is not true. The reality is much more complex. How to deal with trafficking in the context of mixed migration flows? I have advocated in the context of the Global Migration Compact for mainstreaming anti-trafficking action in all the chapters of the global migration. Of course, there is a specific chapter on trafficking, and of course, this must be implemented by national authorities and so international organizations. But the important is to understand that anti-trafficking action should be taken into consideration also under the umbrella and in the context of many actions included in the Global Migration Compact. For example, prevention of labor exploitation through fair recruitment. For example, better integration of the anti-trafficking action in the asylum system, because it is true that indications of trafficking can be identified also in the context and during the procedure for the granting of international protection. So this comprehensive approach should be adopted when we talk about trafficking in mixed migration flows. Of course, identification must be early identification. I devoted a report to the Human Rights Council recently on this issue. Early identification means that dedicated procedures for protective purposes should be in place in transit countries, in places of first arrival. taking into account that, of course, early identification includes interviews that should be repeated in certain cases. It is not it is not to be expected that a person going through an experience of trafficking tells their story at the first contact. A confidence building process is necessary, and of course, a gender oriented approach, a child sensitive approach should be used. Unfortunately, no procedure of this sort is in place in places of first arrival or in transit countries, and the study shows how much these indications can be, on the contrary, identified during the journey. The second issue I would like to underline is the process and the ultimate goal of anti-trafficking action. This means that from the very beginning, every anti-trafficking action should be human rights oriented and should aim to ensure at the end of the process social inclusion of people that survived trafficking. My next report next June in the Human Rights Council will be exactly on social inclusion of trafficked persons, of survivors, which means, of course, the full and permanent restoration of all the rights that have been violated during the trafficking process. And the study shows very well how much human rights abuses and violations are connected with the trafficking process during a migration journey. Of course, when we think about anti-trafficking action in terms of human rights, respect and promotion, we have to think about remedies. We have to think about state obligation to ensure the conditions for the person to be socially included at the end of the process, which means, of course, restoration of liberty, restoration of family unity, which means, of course, residence status, which means compensation. And we know, unfortunately, that very few people get compensation, even when a criminal proceeding has been initiated, and even when the criminal proceedings ends with convictions. Sometimes people are awarded with compensation, but no money has been found, which means that investigation and prosecution should be much more sophisticated, should include from the very beginning financial investigation, to enable the authorities to identify assets and patrimonies that can be confiscated and can be awarded as compensation to trafficked persons. Structural challenges are needed to combat trafficking in the migration routes. Trafficking has been very often used as a justification of restrictive migration policies. It is the reality is exactly the contrary. Restrictive migration policies are themselves a vulnerability factor. So first of all, I have always advocated for regular channels for migration, which is the main prevention tool. But states have also an obligation to combat xenophobic attitudes, and that can even amount to racist behaviors. And states have an obligation to finance adequately protection services and support services, in particular in cooperation with the NGOs. And we know that we have now a dramatic problem of funding especially concerning NGOs, service providers. And of course, I would like to underline the obligation of states to ensure adequate funding to NGOs. Last but not least, I think that we are aware that during their perilous journey, people are targeted by traffickers for subsequent exploitation in destination countries. We see how much sexual exploitation and labor exploitation are installed in countries of the European Union, for example. Of course, I'm trying to engage with the private sector and importantly with trade unions to make it possible that workers' voice is integrated in the mechanisms and at enabling workers to come forward, to denounce, to report exploitation, and to have another option, another viable option in the country. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will be here until 12:15. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gianmarinaro, for your valuable contribution to this webinar, taking into consideration your long-standing experience on this matter. I'm sure that many of the participants would like to pose the questions, and thank you for staying with us in the next 45 minutes. I'm sure there will be a lot of interest. I would also like to thank you about updating us on your next report that will be issued, which will be focused on social integration. It's very relevant, having in mind also the research topic, and I'm sure that we are all very keen to read it and eager to read it. It's now time to hear the presentation of the Strength to Carry On author, Dr. Claire Cleary, who will provide us with the research insights. Claire.
Thank you very much, Elena, and thank you also to Maria Grazia for some extremely relevant words, which I think are very much in line with what we found in this research. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. It's lovely to see such a broad range of participants, including also some of the NGOs and international organizations who we interviewed for the study. Great to have you here, and we're really in a phase where we want to share all of this, these research findings and recommendations and lobby for the implementation of the recommendations. So we very much appreciate you being here for that, and also you helping us with that by making people aware of the study. So just to contextualize this, since 2014 at ICMPD, we have been conducting research in relation to the issue of trafficking in a migration context, in the context of forced migration or mixed migration. Back in 2014, we started research looking at Syria and its neighboring countries and looking at the impact of that movement and of the war itself on vulnerabilities to trafficking. And back then was really when we realized just how important this issue of vulnerabilities is, where they come from, how to understand why trafficking happens. And we found that if you look at those vulnerabilities that the traffickers are targeting, you can also understand how we can prevent it from happening by alleviating those vulnerabilities. We followed up then last year with an EU-funded project, trafficking along migration routes to Europe. And here, one of the clear findings, as Maria Grazia so clearly explained, was the fact that anti-trafficking is very often not incorporated into migration and asylum processes, and equally that the anti-trafficking response doesn't really take into account migration and asylum issues. I'm also very happy to see that the principal author of this study, who I co-authored it with, is joining us today as well, Roberto Forin, who now works at the Mixed Migration Center. So then this study that we are talking about today is also in this context of migration routes. And here we wanted to broaden the scope a little bit to, as Maria Grazia said, be a little bit more innovative in terms of looking at the vulnerabilities and understanding them, but also trying to understand people's resilience. And for those people who are traveling along these routes, to what extent, what are the factors that actually protect them from being trafficked, that make them more resilient to these kind of abuses. So moving then swiftly into the study itself, we carried out this research in the framework of a project that was funded by the US State Department, the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. And the project was called Study on Trafficking, Resilience and Vulnerability en route to Europe. We started in October 2017, so in a context where migration was still very much on the agenda, and these migration routes were also very much a focus, but where to a certain extent the numbers of people traveling had already started to reduce. The countries under study were Greece, Bulgaria, North Macedonia, Serbia, Hungary, Germany and Italy. And as Elena briefly explained, we had country researchers working in each of these countries who were experts in that national context, and were also able to interview people and able to conduct the research there. And so the study that we produced is basically an analysis of all of those findings in those 7 countries, as well as at a regional level in the EU and in other European countries. So briefly then, the scope, we looked at the Eastern Mediterranean route, so from Turkey to Greece, and many people there carrying on along the Balkan route from the Eastern Mediterranean towards Western Europe. And we also looked at the Central Mediterranean migration route, so people traveling from North Africa to Italy, mostly departing from Libya. In terms of the thematic scope, we wanted to look at the incidence of trafficking itself. So we're really looking at the phenomenon of trafficking, what kind of cases are taking place. This is also based on our previous experience of conducting trafficking research, where we always find a large disconnect between, or a discrepancy between, the numbers of identified trafficking cases and the phenomenon itself and how it's taking place. So we're always attempting to go deeper and try to understand what's really happening on the ground, and not just relying on official data. And then, as I mentioned, we also wanted to look at, on the one hand, what makes people more resilient to trafficking and other related abuses, and on the other hand, what are the vulnerabilities? And this is always with the purpose of trying to understand how can we prevent this from happening. So as well as it being very important to respond to trafficking cases that happen, and that's sort of what's covered by the first research question, we also wanted to understand which are these factors that could maybe prevent, how can we promote people's resilience, and how can we alleviate people's vulnerabilities. We focused the research on the period between 2015 to 2018. So 2015 being the year when there was a significant increase in people arriving, particularly along the Eastern Mediterranean and Balkan route. And we continued the research all the way through 2018, which was the year when the country researchers were conducting the field research. In terms of who we focused on, we made it very broad. We looked at all children and adults who are traveling along these routes, or had traveled along the routes, from non-EU countries. So the vast majority of them, of course, then ultimately applying for asylum in a European country. But we really wanted to cover, people regardless of their status, also because people move in and out of status throughout the journey. We very much focused on issues of child protection, issues of child trafficking. We didn't directly interview any children under 18 for the research for ethical reasons, and because we didn't feel that we were in a position to do it properly. But due to the very good work of the country researchers, we were able to interview a number of young adults who had arrived in Europe along these routes when they were still children, and also from other stakeholders. We obtained a lot of information in relation to children's situation, as well as in relation to adults. So you can see here the main routes that we were focusing on. On the one hand, on the left of the slide, you see the Eastern Mediterranean and Balkan routes, with people arriving largely by sea to the islands in the Aegean off the coast of Turkey, and then to the mainland in Greece, and traveling onwards from there to North Macedonia. Also smaller numbers of people who crossed by land from Turkey into either Bulgaria or Greece, and continued onwards from there. So from North Macedonia, most people carried on through Serbia, through Hungary. And then we also, in our research, focused on Germany as the most important destination country in absolute numbers in order to understand what happens then in more of a destination context. Although it definitely should be said, particularly at this point, during the past few years, that many of these originally transit countries have become de facto destination countries for many people also. Then we also looked at the central Mediterranean route. So you can see here on the map, in the earlier years, 2015, 2016, 2017, a lot of people were arriving through Libya to Italy from origin countries in Eastern Horn of Africa and in West Africa. Recently, there's been much higher numbers of people arriving from North African countries. So in Italy, most arrivals these days are from Tunisia. And this route, of course, I think probably all participants are aware of many of the very extreme issues in Libya as a transit country and the human rights abuses that take place there, including different forms of trafficking. So moving back to the Balkan route, what we found very useful and as the research findings became available, because it was very much inductive research, so we see what the field research shows us, and we found that you can divide that period up into 4 pretty distinct phases because of what was taking place. And this is very important when it comes to what Maria Grazia mentioned about restrictive migration policies being a source of vulnerability. Because here what we have in the first half of 2015, we have an increase in people transiting. We have a sort of ad hoc arrangements in different countries along the route because people were not prepared. These countries were not prepared for receiving so many people in transit through their countries. And so by June 2015, many countries, particularly Greece, North Macedonia, and Serbia, put in place mechanisms by which people could transit regularly. So, for example, they had 72 hours in order to transit through the country. In order to do that, they just had to express their intention that they would seek asylum, but not actually make the application. And that allowed them to regularly travel. And so you had a lot of people using public transport, a very low need for the services of migrant smugglers at that point. A lot of people who we interviewed said that they needed the assistance of a smuggler maybe to get from Turkey to the Greek islands. But after that, the transit was pretty much regularized. It was cheaper for them. It was safer for them. It was faster. And then in March 2016, we had the EU-Turkey statement. And this really heralded the beginning of a much more restrictive phase, which many of our interviewees referred to as the closing of the route. So you see, for example, and we have a quote from an interviewee from the Red Cross in North Macedonia who said, after the closing of the route, every second migrant is a victim of either trafficking or smuggling, every second, and maybe any woman traveling alone or traveling at all is a potential victim of trafficking. What we see is a huge increase in the vulnerabilities and the dangers of the trip, and also in the demand for migrant smuggling and in interactions with migrant smugglers because of a necessity, because it was no longer possible to make the trip independently. So that was the period of the closing of the route. In the last 2 years of the period that we looked at, we saw the impact to a certain extent of these measures, which have meant that there are significantly reduced numbers of people traveling, but there are still numbers of people traveling, and their situation has become much worse. People are stranded, people are in far more desperate situations, and some of the abuses and the trafficking cases that we've seen have become much more severe because of this situation. Then if we look at the central Mediterranean route, we have to a certain extent a similar situation in that a lot of these EU level developments also affected people arriving in Italy. Hotspots were also set up in Italy as in Greece. The relocation program was put in place. But you have basically 2016 being the year that there were the highest number of people arriving. And then in February 2017, Italy signed a memorandum of understanding with Libya. And from then on, the numbers significantly reduced to much lower numbers last year in Italy. Although, as many of you know, on the other hand, there was a significant increase in the numbers of people arriving in Spain during that year. And then moving on to, and I wanted to share with you some of the key findings of our research, because as Elena said, you may not have time to read through the entire study, but we definitely wanted to make you aware of some of the main issues that we encountered and some of the findings that we were surprised, I think, to find such innovative and new findings, given that so much research had been conducted on this issue, but still there were many things that policymakers and practitioners and researchers were not really aware of. So the first key finding relates to personal characteristics and circumstances. In the policy debate, I think we often talk about unaccompanied children being particularly vulnerable, about women and girls due to gender issues being particularly vulnerable, and certain other categories. And what we found is that that's not exactly the case, in the sense that it's not somebody's personal characteristics or features or their particular circumstances that make them more resilient or more vulnerable, but rather the actual context. So if a child is considered vulnerable for being a child, yes, but that it depends on how they travel. If they travel together with their family, they're in a much more resilient situation. If they travel from the beginning alone, or at some point they get separated from their family, that can make them much more vulnerable. Equally for women and girls, I'll talk a bit more about that. When there are protection measures in place, they can actually be more resilient than men and boys. So it really very much depends. I think this is sort of good news if we want to respond, because it means that we actually do have a lot of room to improve the situation. It's not just because you have women and girls that they are always going to be vulnerable, but actually if you have the right responses, you can really mitigate that vulnerability. The second finding I wanted to talk about, which Maria Grazia also mentioned, and which indeed is really a key finding of this study, and definitely goes against the grain of what the many of the political statements made within the EU and in other countries, which is that more restrictive migration policies will actually cause people to be more vulnerable to trafficking, will also increase the demand for smuggling. So in terms of fighting these forms of crimes, restrictive migration policies are one of the worst ways to prevent them. The different levels of resilience and vulnerability among people traveling are really determined by, for example, at the most resilient level, if somebody can travel regularly. So if somebody is being resettled within a refugee resettlement program, or they're traveling regularly as a labor migrant or under a family reunification provision, this is really obviously the most resilient scenario. They're so much less likely to be abused or trafficked. And unfortunately, the focus of our study was on people who didn't have access and who had to make this journey, and the journey itself is definitely a key source of vulnerability. But during that phase that we spoke about of regularized transit, people can still remain resilient by traveling safely, by it not being so expensive, by having less interaction with migrant smugglers, and traveling quite rapidly, relatively speaking, to their intended final destination. Then when you have the situation where mobility is restricted, that's when the vulnerability really increases. The third key finding then looks a bit more at this interaction with migrant smugglers, which for us, we tried very much to maintain the thematic focus of the study on trafficking, but migrant smuggling is so important in this context because everybody who travels will probably have to at least once interact with a migrant smuggler. Very often, smugglers as actors are considered very negative actors, and it's very much associated with trafficking and with human rights abuses. And we did find some cases like that. On the other hand, I think one of the really interesting findings is that when somebody has a positive experience of migrant smuggling, meaning that they pay for a service and the service is provided and there are no abuses, this actually maintains their resilience. This is a way of them traveling safely and relatively rapidly to the final destination. So in general, it is important to avoid interaction with smugglers, but on the other hand, if the smuggler really provides the service, then that can keep people resilient from abuses. So one Pakistani man, for example, who our country researcher interviewed in Serbia, described his experience. It depends. If your smuggler is good, you'll be good. If your smuggler is not good, you won't be good. When I was in prison, I met with a smuggler. His brother was with me for 15 months. So then he had a reference for this person and knew that he could trust them. And he said, in this period, I did not get into any bad experiences with smugglers just because he was very good to me. He took me from Bulgaria to here. He always tried to minimize the walking. He always tried to suggest a good game for me, a fast one. So many of the people traveling along the route refer to this attempt to cross borders as the game. And it's a game they have to keep trying regularly. And in this case, he had a positive experience with the smuggler, which increased his resilience. And I think this points out that some of our responses to smuggling and trafficking are maybe not appropriate, given that in this case, the person was not subject to any human rights abuses, even though he was using a smuggler. Access to information is also key, and this is where it comes to people who are traveling, their own personal sources of resilience and how they themselves can stay safe. One Syrian man who was interviewed by a country researcher in Germany spoke about his journey. So he was traveling alone throughout this period, but he said, I was with people who'd gone on the same journey. I was connected with people on Facebook at each stage of my trip. I wrote to them, described where I was, asked them what to do and which route to take, and they explained to him how to carry on. He said, for example, in the last village in Serbia, I didn't know how to proceed. I logged onto Facebook and immediately I received a reply and was directed to a village where I could find taxis. So this source of information from other people who had already traveled allowed him to know where he was going, to know how to continue, and to not be vulnerable to any potentially abusive actors along the way. So we found, on the other hand, that other people were in a situation where maybe they didn't have a smartphone or they weren't used to using social media, and therefore they were much more vulnerable because they didn't have this access to information from people other than migrant smugglers or human traffickers. Looking at the destination context then, and when somebody is applying for asylum or is trying to regularize their immigration status, this is an extremely important moment as well, because if somebody is waiting for a very long time for an asylum decision, a decision on international protection, or a decision on their status, they're usually not allowed to work, and they're in a very vulnerable situation at that point. One Nigerian man who was interviewed, living at an accommodation center where he was waiting for a decision, and our interviewer asked him, do you know of anybody who's being exploited? And his response to us was extremely surprising in a way, but also tells us that maybe we're looking at it the wrong way. He said, we'd be so happy if somebody would try to exploit us, but there's nobody. Even if we had to work for 7 days a week and get paid for 1 day, we would happily do it. So for him, the most important thing is to be able to work at all. But he's making himself extremely vulnerable to labor exploitation because of the desperation, because of waiting so long, because of family expectations. He would be willing to work under any conditions. So people having a regular status and having access to the regular labor market is absolutely key if we want to prevent these kinds of situations. Then this is also another key point. We found that access to essential services like safety, accommodation, education, employment, healthcare is extremely important, and this affects different groups differently. We referred to it in the study as the paradox of vulnerable groups, because we found that in some cases, groups like women and girls, families, children, unaccompanied children, in some cases they're actually in a more resilient situation because if there is child-specific and gender-specific services in place, then it actually makes them more resilient. They are taken care of. Now, that's of course not always the case, and it's very important that those services are in place. But when they are, it can really make these groups more resilient. On the other hand, we found that very often adult men, but also older teenage boys, were extremely vulnerable because they were simply overlooked by these kind of protection services. They were not considered. It was not considered that they should have access. In this context, we have a majority of men and boys moving. The majority of people traveling at all are adult men. The majority of unaccompanied children are teenage boys. And these are the groups that actually we found, unfortunately, many trafficking cases. And we also found serious vulnerabilities because of this perception that they're resilient and not considering that there should be services available. And this is very important in terms of our response also. Looking then specifically at unaccompanied children, as I mentioned, if these services are in place a child can be resilient. If they're identified as unaccompanied, provided with protection, provided with a proper, committed, trained guardian, then their situation can be much better. Also, if they can be swiftly reunited with their parents. But what interferes with that and makes unaccompanied children vulnerable very often is, for example, when they're incorrectly identified as an adult instead of as a child. When the authorities, and this happened very often, particularly when higher numbers of people were traveling, when a child was traveling with some adults and the authorities or the protection services didn't really make much of an effort to determine whether they were actually the parents or guardians of that child. And so the child continued to travel with adults who were not related to them and making them extremely vulnerable to trafficking and other abuses. In some cases, either from the child's perspective, they want to move on very quickly, so they declare that they're adults so that they can just get out of the protection system and get to the country that they wanted to go to, their intended final destination, where perhaps they have family or they know of opportunities. So they'll just carry on. And also, and I think we've known this in the child protection field for a long time, but it's still a really severe issue, which is that unaccompanied children, anyway, the majority of them are 16 or 17. And so while waiting for a status determination or waiting for some kind of a resolution of their situation, they turn 18 and therefore no longer have access to any of this. One of our recommendations in the study is really to have a transition phase for young adults. If somebody has arrived as an unaccompanied child, then there should be additional support in place between the ages of 18 and 21 for that transition into adulthood. Because right now we see this moment of turning 18, of aging out, as an extreme moment of vulnerability. So the last few issues I wanted to discuss here, and I'm finishing up now, is in relation to the trafficking phenomenon itself. And I think Maria Grazia explained very clearly the reason for this, and it's really a severe issue. If you look at the official statistics on the countries that we looked at, if you look at the statistics for the EU in general, you won't find many cases of trafficking recorded that have targeted this group. So people from these origin countries who are arriving along the migration routes have not really generally been identified as trafficked. What we found by doing the qualitative research, by interviewing the people themselves who had traveled, by interviewing NGOs, international organizations, people on the front lines who are responding, we found a much higher incidence than you would see in the figures, far, far higher. We found forms of exploitation that were not really being registered by the authorities, and we found particular groups of victims who were not coming to the attention of the authorities. In the study, we identified a total of 69 cases where we had more detail, where we look at a sort of a case study, and where it looked like this was a potential trafficking case. We also found broader indications of more widespread cases as well. In addition to this, we found many cases of deprivation of liberty for extortion, which is not generally considered a trafficking issue, but which takes place very often in this context, where migrant smugglers take this opportunity to lock somebody up who's using their services and then extort more money from them. And this person is a victim of an abuse, they're being exploited for this extortion. So very much many of the features of trafficking are in place, but it's not generally considered a trafficking case. And as you also see here, we have a larger number of cases involving men and boys, 42 cases versus 27 involving women and girls. So you see also this issue of men and boys being targeted and it not always being recognized. In terms of the forms of exploitation, we do see, as in any context, sexual exploitation and labor exploitation being among the most common forms. There are particular cases targeting also boys and men, cases of sexual exploitation that are not normally focused on. That's also an important finding. Another key issue in this context is trafficking for forced criminal activities. And here we found when we looked at the smuggling issue that many people who are involved at lower levels in migrant smuggling, in guiding people and carrying people across borders, were not doing that of their own free will, have been forced in various different ways, using some of the means that we know from the trafficking definition. So that's also something that needs to be looked at very seriously, because I think right now we're running the risk of arresting people as migrant smugglers when actually they may be victims of trafficking for forced migrant smuggling. It's something we need to take into account. And I mentioned also deprivation of liberty for extortion. Finally, then, and this is really looking at all of the cases of potential trafficking that we encountered in the study, we found that basically you can divide them into two different types of cases. One is really where somebody contracts a smuggler, and that smuggler uses the opportunity to exploit the person. So they need the smuggling services, they're in that vulnerable situation, and then the smuggler actually also commits the crime of trafficking. But what we also found is many cases where somebody was being smuggled and they needed to pay for a smuggler and they needed to continue on their journey, but it wasn't the smuggler who abused them or exploited them. A third party, another actor, saw that they were in this vulnerable situation and took advantage of that vulnerability. So if you look at the definition of trafficking, one of the means is the abuse of a position of vulnerability. And in almost all of the cases that we looked at, we found this means of abuse of a position of vulnerability, and that position of vulnerability is that somebody needs to travel, their mobility is being blocked, and they need to contract a smuggler in order to do that. I think that's extremely important also in terms of the response. We have a number of both policy level recommendations in terms of responding that are very much linked to the research findings. I think I won't go into them in detail now. You can see them here on the slide. I think it's important that we also have a discussion on this, and we can also refer back to the recommendations at that point. But in the meantime, I look forward to your comments and questions, and I'll have a look at the chat box now as well to see what's relevant there. But for the moment, I'll pass it back to Elena.
Thanks, Claire, for providing us with the overview of the research and highlighting the key findings and recommendations. 69 potential cases, trafficking cases, is a huge number in this context, and I think that this will be an alert to the policymakers to make further steps regardingly, and that this research will then reflect afterwards. I see now that we can start the question and answers debate. There are many questions already in the chat window. I would like just to inform you that unfortunately I just learned from Sanya that Stacy cannot join us. I mean, she is here, she can listen to us, but her microphone is not working, unfortunately. So we will not include her in this session, but she's also welcome to participate through the chat option. I would use now the presence of Ms. Gianmarinaro, because I think she will be with us in the next 10 minutes. So if any of you participants have a question to Ms. Gianmarinaro, I would strongly encourage you to put it either in the chat window or maybe, which works very fast, much faster, to raise the hand button. We will unmute your microphone and we will give you an option to pose the question orally. For now, I would like to ask her, if you allow me, I would ask Ms. Gianmarinaro to reflect on one of our key policy recommendations, which is expanding the alternatives for regular travel. My question would be, as most of her work is related to policy level, the question is very simple. Actually, Claire before reflected upon some alternatives that could reflect on this recommendation. But Ms. Gianmarinaro, do you think that this is realistic? How realistic is expanding the options for regular travel, thinking from the policy perspective? Do we have Ms. Gianmarinaro still?
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, we hear you.
Okay. So of course, we have a very difficult political climate. This is very clear. But we have also the Global Migration Compact, and I hope that the idea of governing migration policies instead of following routes that result in absolutely nothing can be appealing, at least for some governments. Of course, we will continue to advocate for that. This is something that is possible if migration is seen from a realistic and rational point of view. And I hope that in the future, at least some governments will adopt this approach, because the reality is that other approaches, the current approaches, don't work, because the current approaches, increase the vulnerability of people, and of course don't have any real impact on the management of migration flows. So of course we will continue our work, and we will see what this will produce.
Thank you, Ms. Gianmarinaro. Thank you about your valuable work in this context. I was just told by Sanya that we have a participant that it's raising his hand, but I cannot see it now. Can you please allow Mr. Kochowski? Do we hear him? Unfortunately, I think that we cannot hear him. Just a second. Mr. Kochowski, can you hear us? Meantime,
can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Petraska. I'm not sure. This is Ivan Kochowski from IOM, the Office for the Western Balkans. Thank you for organizing this webinar. It's quite a lot of it's quite useful, and a lot of new information is coming out. But I wanted to ask, because during the 2015 and 16 mixed migration movements, I had the chance to work in the transit camps in Macedonia, or North Macedonia. But I wanted to, and we saw this, that with the closure of the humanitarian routes or corridor, and the stopping of the regularized transit, vulnerability is increased, or at least the risks of trafficking and exploitation increased in Macedonia. Is this the case for the whole region? Are there other examples where regularized transit and travel have reduced the risks and vulnerabilities to various types of exploitation, or this has not been the case throughout the whole region? I'm not sure who is more appropriate to answer this question, but I'll just leave it open like that.
I'm sorry. I will give the floor to the both speakers to answer to this question if they think it's relevant for their work. Ms. Gianmarinaro, do we still have you here? Then I would kindly ask Claire to answer this question.
Thank you very much, Ivan, and it's an extremely important question in terms of the impact, like you said, of these restrictions on people's vulnerabilities. It's interesting, when you were talking, I was thinking about also one of the issues with the research was, we planned this multi-country study, and we had research being conducted at national and local level in each of the countries. But then when we were interviewing people around the move, that really wasn't how they saw it at all, because it's a journey. And the national perspective also, it often only tells you a very limited amount, because people have different experiences as they travel along. So in answer to your question, if you take, for example, the period of regularized transit, so from June 2015 onwards, at that time, you had a system in place whereby Greece was recording people's data and issuing them with a certificate. They were then, most of them, traveling onwards to North Macedonia, where they were again issued with a form of legal status, a certificate of intention to seek asylum. When they carried on to Serbia, which was quite quickly, as I'm sure you know, within a day or two at the most, carrying on to Serbia, and they're also being issued with a certificate of intention to seek asylum. So and some work has been done on this, on this sort of domino effect, and how what each country did influenced what another country did. When one country started to be more restrictive, the others responded. In this case, actually, at the beginning, it was the opposite. It was, countries sort of allowing regular transit, and then the countries along the route also allowing it. What is different is that once people left Serbia, sometimes that was when they needed to contact a smuggler again, even during that period, because as of September 2015, Hungary already started to restrict movement a lot more, put in place the transit zones, started building fences, and it's much more difficult. So either people got stuck there, or they used a smuggler to try to evade the system, or they started to use different routes to different countries. Then again, when people left Hungary, they often traveled through Austria, where I'm based, traveled relatively quickly onwards to Germany, because Germany had also, as we all remember, in summer of 2015, declared that for certain nationalities they wouldn't apply Dublin transfers, and so people could just carry on to there. So the countries along the route were sort of cooperating and communicating in different ways, and that all, from a political science point of view, that had very specific impact. Then, of course, when the agreement was reached in March with Turkey, that had very serious impacts, and really along the route, countries then slowly started to restrict movement more. And you do have quite Hungary is slightly different, but the other countries along the route sort of coherently responded to each other, for better or for worse, applying very similar provisions. And you also, it's interesting to look at, it's a little bit beyond the scope of our study, but it's interesting to look at what then subsequently happened in Croatia and in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where the routes were sort of diverted through to those countries and to Slovenia, and then they responded in certain ways. But it's one journey for the people who are traveling, but then for the countries along the route, they really struggle to coordinate a kind of a reasonable response, a response that makes sense, and a response that's not just sort of saying, well, I'm not going to let people through, then the next country says they're not going to let people through. And it's a little bit, I think, a failure to a certain extent of particularly EU cooperation. When you look at the EU countries involved, and you look at North Macedonia and Serbia also as accession candidates, that the coordination was not better and was not more sort of logical and less politically motivated. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Ivan, for posing the question. Thank you, Claire, for the comprehensive answer. I see that Ms. Gian Marinara, unfortunately, would like to leave. She has to leave, and she thanks to the study and the webinar, and she congratulates the author. We also want to really thank her for sharing her valuable expertise and participating in this webinar. I suggest we now move to the new questions. I see in the option that in the chat window that there are a lot of questions about children. You already reflect upon this, Claire, but I would like to kindly ask you to take some of these questions and to maybe share with us some of the cases, because there is a full annex in the study with a lot of cases that we found out through the research. Could you please also reflect upon the recommendations and tell us what would need to be done in order to ensure better protection and make these children less vulnerable and more resilient?
Yeah, thanks, Elena. So, yeah, I mean, there's a discussion in the chat box about the definition of children. We definitely apply the definition as per the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child of any person under 18. It's a really tricky issue. We heard from our country researcher in Serbia that There are some young Afghan young adults, young men, and also teenage boys that are in very serious situations of vulnerability. And in fact, there were 2 cases of murders among this group in Serbia. It's really extreme very often. Steven and some of the other country researchers interviewed many of these young men, and found that the situation they're in is really critical in many cases. So what you have is, when you look specifically at the issue of unaccompanied children, you have up to around 90% of unaccompanied children are boys, coming from countries like Afghanistan, Pakistan, then in the context of Italy, coming from countries like Eritrea, Gambia, Nigeria. And there really doesn't seem to be any efforts to properly protect these boys as children, and then when they turn 18, to properly protect their human rights. So maybe to give an example of the situation that they end up in, there was a case in one of the countries of a boy who, he was from Afghanistan. He arrived in a transit country in Europe when he was about 16. He had a plan to continue to Germany, to meet up with family members there and to set up his life there, but he was blocked. He couldn't continue in 2016, and he didn't see a way of carrying on or of making money. And so he was targeted by a group of migrant smugglers, and told that, if he started providing migrant smuggling services and guiding people and across borders and so on, that would allow him then to achieve his goals and to carry on. In the meantime, he continued to provide that service. Initially, he was a younger child, a 15-year-old, 16-year-old, being forced in certain ways and his vulnerability abused in order to engage him in criminal activities. But as time went on, 2 things happened. One was that he continued to engage in the criminal activities because he saw that he could actually make a profit from that, and actually saw some kind of future for himself. And as time went on, he turned 18. And so this is a person who started off as a very vulnerable child in a very vulnerable situation, who I think that, we need to make a bit more of an effort, but we should definitely see as a victim. But because he received absolutely no protection, and at no point was he taken out of this situation, now, as a 19-year-old man, we see him just as a criminal. And according to the law, he is just a criminal. He is just committing a crime. And so these are the sort of issues that we're creating bigger problems by not responding from the beginning with a protective approach. And this is quite dangerous, I think, for his own future, but also in general for combating crime and so on. For unaccompanied children, another brief point I wanted to make is that there's sometimes a tendency to think of an unaccompanied child as sort of that's who they are and that's their identity, and to forget that this is a child who has a family somewhere, right? Very, very few of the unaccompanied children are actually orphans, and I think that there hasn't been enough, and member states in the EU and other European countries are not making enough of an effort to reunite these children with their families. So what very often happens is that they're waiting for ages for maybe a parent to come from a country of origin, and in the meantime they turn 18 and they no longer even have a right for that person to join them. Or also what we saw a lot is family separation along the route. There's a lot of information in the study about that, where children actually started off their journey traveling together with their guardians or parents, which is, the ideal situation for most children. And because of border control measures, or because of the authorities' actions, or sometimes because smugglers separated them, they became separated, and it takes years sometimes for them to reunite again, which is extremely detrimental to their development and a violation of their child rights. So I think that's also an extremely important issue, to not sort of see unaccompanied children as forever unaccompanied, but to make every effort, as long as it's in their best interest, to reunite them with family and to recreate this safe situation for them.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Claire. That this is a very interesting case and one of the key findings of the study, which also leads us to other questions. Actually, forcing to conduct smuggling and criminal activities is can this be considered as a quite new form of exploitation? And what other forms of exploitation, of trafficking and exploitation, have been found throughout the research?
Yeah, I mean, whenever people talk about new forms of exploitation, I don't think it makes sense, because I think what we're often looking at is forms of exploitation that just have not been recognized as such. So they've been taking place all along, but we just haven't seen that. It raises, of course, very important issues in terms of the person who has been forced to engage in a criminal activity not being punished. So we have recommendations in relation to applying non-punishment provisions to people who have been trafficked, whether it's for forced migrant smuggling, another form of forced criminal activities. We have some cases of also forced drug trafficking and sale of drugs. It's relevant also for more minor administrative offences where non-punishment provisions are very important. So I think we need to engage with this much more seriously and stop just, arresting people and charging them without trying to understand if maybe they're a victim of trafficking. The other form that I think is really important is this deprivation of liberty for extortion, because we have a lot of people arriving in Europe who have been subject to this human rights violation and who are basically just considered irregular migrants, or if they apply for asylum, they're asylum applicants. And it's not, there's no attempt to consider whether maybe this is a form of trafficking and maybe this person should actually be treated like a victim, and there should be like in any other trafficking case, everything should be in place to protect them, to provide access to justice, to prosecute the offenders, and so on. We then have not so much different forms of trafficking, because a lot of the trafficking taking place is sexual exploitation of women and girls, also of men and boys, which is important. And labor trafficking takes place in particular ways, like in Greece and Turkey, there's a lot of labor exploitation in agriculture, whereas in Serbia, North Macedonia, Hungary, it tends to be more in the service industry. But we need to take this approach of recognizing that this particular group of people are vulnerable to trafficking. And so we need to look at them as potential victims. We need to look at these forms of exploitation as potential trafficking cases, and basically, stop having, Maria Grazia mentioned it as well, stop having this like ideal image of a victim of trafficking that you see on posters about trafficking and so on, because here, very often in this case, due to the sheer numbers, a victim of trafficking is going to be an adult man who does not look vulnerable and does not look like a victim, but from all the information that we have, it's very clear from a legal and human rights point of view that indeed they are a victim of trafficking.
I personally hope that this study will reflect on the raising awareness among all the relevant stakeholders. Thank you, Claire. We don't have a lot of time left, but I wonder if you could quickly answer us to the last question that I can see in the chat option, is that actually during the 2016 movements, when there were huge migration flows through Balkan route, the asylum procedure was used as a key protection measure, because people in that way were allowed to travel regularly and to move towards Europe. The question is, since then, have the governments take over or used some other protection solutions? On the meeting that we had 2 days ago, you also mentioned some alternatives, options for this regular travel. Could you please reflect upon this before we close the webinar?
Yeah, thanks very much for that question. The simple answer is no, but I'll also explain why. I think you're correct in that what you actually had, particularly in say Greece, North Macedonia, Serbia, and Bulgaria, was a transit situation rather than an international protection situation, because regardless of the motivations for that person traveling, each person may have been in a refugee situation or not, but regardless of that, what they were doing was transiting, and what they wanted to do was transit. And those countries responded sort of within the asylum system, or a kind of a quasi-asylum system of this, issuing a certificate of an intention to seek asylum, in order to allow people to transit. So, as you mentioned, it really wasn't ideal. That's all changed now anyway, and I think there is an attempt, because people are stranded, basically because people want to continue, but then they end up in one of these transit countries. I spoke a month or two ago to somebody who was in a transit country, and I asked, so you got asylum here, so you'll settle here, are you happy? And they were like, well, this was not what I wanted, so I'm happy that my situation is regularized, but it wasn't my intention to stay here. But there has been an attempt, because that's the direction in which the policy goes, is to keep somebody in a country, even if they don't want to be in that particular country and they don't have any family or connections there, or in the case of this person, didn't even know anybody at all from the same country. So that's one approach, is to provide people access to asylum or to a regular migration status in that transit country or in a destination country. But I think what's far more important is to prevent people from having to take this journey at all. And I think we all know this, because during the last 4 years, if you've been reading the newspapers at all, like, you see the number of different dangerous situations. One of them is trafficking. Another issue is like this kidnapping, deprivation of liberty, but there are so many dangers. There's also sexual and gender-based violence. There's also child abuse. Nobody really should have to take this journey at all. And so we need to look very seriously at the alternatives. Your question is like, have governments used these alternatives? And unfortunately, they really haven't done that enough. There are some resettlement programs for refugees to travel regularly. We need to look more at regular migration, at allowing people the opportunity to travel regularly as a labour migrant, under family unification, as a student, because right now many of the people from these countries of origin, we interviewed people who tried to do it regularly and they weren't able to. And so we have to promote these opportunities for regular travel. And at the end of last year, the European Parliament issued a recommendation on an EU humanitarian visa. That possibility doesn't exist right now, so it's not possible to say, I want to seek asylum, can I have a visa to travel regularly? But there's a recommendation to the European Council to adopt that and have EU member states issuing humanitarian visas for people to travel regularly and seek asylum. And I think those are the only ways forward. Anything else is just going to cause people to continue to use these dangerous routes, to not see any alternatives, and to end up in these situations. If we're really serious about preventing trafficking, human rights abuses, migrant smuggling, and so on, the only way is to look at all of them. We do have like a broad spectrum of potential legal channels. There should be an option for the various categories of people, and so I think that's really the main recommendation.
Thank you, Claire. For sure, there are a lot of options, as we heard. We just need more political will and policy level will to do it. We are coming to the end of this webinar. As a conclusion, I would like to say that we cannot keep making the excuse of thinking that this is temporary situation. The key findings and recommendations of this study also showed us this. The factors that will contribute to the incidence of trafficking among the population groups are already clearly in evidence. And it is by using the knowledge, by using the discussions like these ones in this session today, to contribute to make a step further in addressing these problems eventually reduce the likelihood of trafficking cases along migration routes in the future. My thanks to all of these who contributed to the webinar today. First and foremost to Ms. Gian Marinaro and to Claire for sharing your valuable expertise. Also for Stacy for trying to be in this virtual room. And to you participants for such a lively and interesting exchanges and contributions. Also my sincere gratitude to my colleague Sanya here for mastering the technical aspects of the webinar. And before we close, I would kindly ask you to answer a simple question to evaluate this webinar by clicking on one of the multiple choices that we'll be giving in the poll for a second. I would like to tell you that the chat option will be open for the next 15 minutes, so the participants can discuss further if this is needed. And there were some questions at the very beginning about if our publications and our research work is available. Yes, it is on our website, but also on the links that were shared on the introduction slide. You can access them easily. If you have troubles finding some of our pieces of research on our website, just you can freely contact us. I sincerely hope that there will be future opportunities for similar discussions like this, and I would like to thank you again and say goodbye.